The sound of knowing is not the same as knowing. Moment where I caught myself, mid-presentation, somewhere in the middle of a sentence, and thought, I don't know if I believe what I just said. And the room didn't know. Nobody pushed back. In the next 20 plus minutes, I'm going to tell you what the sound of knowing actually costs. Why most leaders can't tell the difference between fluency and genuine knowledge. And the specific moment I realized I was the broken system. Because there's a version of competence that is actually just fluency. You've done enough repetitions that the language works. I have been both people in that story. The room not being safe enough for reality. That one just requires you to look at it honestly. Yeah, so there's a moment. And I think most people who have been in executive roles for a few years have felt it without being able to name it. It's the moment when you realize the words are coming out right. The cadence is right. You're watching a CFO lean forward. You're watching the board nod. And something in you registers. This is landing. And you start listening to yourself the way the room is listening to you. And that is the trap. Because there's a version of competence that is actually just fluency. You've done enough repetitions that the language works, the framing works, the answers come fast, and fast, confident answers in a conference room look identical to actually knowing something, to everyone in the room, including yourself. I came up wiring buildings before I ever wired networks, and what I remember about that work is that equipment doesn't care what you sound like. A breaker either holds or it trips. There's no political capital in an open neutral. The feedback is fast and indifferent and completely unimpressed by your vocabulary. Executive culture mostly runs the opposite direction. The feedback is slow. It's mediated by relationships and politics and people who don't want to be the one who says the thing. So you can sound right for a very long time before you find out you weren't.
So Thomas, be candid. How long did it take you to notice that in yourself?
Longer than I should admit, honestly. I think I was probably in my early 40s before I had a moment where I caught myself, mid-presentation, somewhere in the middle of a sentence, and thought, I don't know if I believe what I just said. Not that it was wrong, I genuinely didn't know. I was saying a thing that sounded like analysis, but it was actually a feeling dressed up in the language of analysis. And the room didn't know. Nobody pushed back. The meeting ended. We moved on. That scared me more than being wrong would have.
Why do people do it? The performance of knowing, I mean.
Fear, mostly. But, and this is the part that gets missed, not fear of being wrong. That's the surface answer. The deeper thing is fear of being seen as someone who doesn't belong in the room. There is a tax that gets assessed, especially early in your career, for admitting uncertainty. And most people pay that tax once, publicly, in a way that costs them something, and they learn not to pay it again. So they develop the sound. They learn the vocabulary. They learn which questions to answer differently depending on who's asking. They get very good at appearing to know. And then, here's the thing nobody really talks about, that competence starts to feel real because it generates results. You made a call, it worked. You made another call, that worked too. After a while, the fluency and the genuine knowing are so intertwined that you stop being able to tell which one is driving.
Interesting. What does it feel like from the inside when it's the fluency driving and not the knowing?
I think it feels like confidence, which is the problem. I think the real signal, for me at least, and I'm still working on this, is whether I can feel the question underneath the answer. Whether there's something that I know I don't know that's alive in the room with me. When that's there, I trust myself more. When the answer just arrives, clean, without friction, I've learned to be a little suspicious of that. The one I see most often in security, in data, in AI strategy is the post-mortem that reveals that someone on the team knew. They knew something was wrong. The data lineage was questionable. The control wasn't working the way the presentation said it was. A vendor's claim didn't match what you could actually verify. And they said something. Once, maybe twice. And then they read the room, and the room didn't want it, and they stopped. That's not a technology failure. That's not even a process failure. That's what happens when a leader's performance of certainty becomes so convincing that the people closest to the work stop believing their own read of the situation. Because the boss sounds so sure. And who am I to argue with that confidence? I have been both people in that story. I've been the person who sounded sure and was missing something. And I've been the person in the room who had the something and calculated that saying it wasn't worth the cost. Both of those are failure modes, and both of them come from the same root.
What's the root then?
The room not being safe enough for reality. And I don't mean safe in the soft HR sense, the psychological safety language that's gotten so worn down that it doesn't mean much anymore. I mean specifically, does the most junior person in the meeting believe they will be heard if they say the thing that contradicts the direction we're already going? If the answer is no, and in most organizations, the honest answer is no, then you don't have a decision-making process. You have a ratification process. The decisions are happening somewhere else, on less information, by people who sound more confident than they have any right to be.
You said you've been both people in that story. Which one was harder to admit?
The confident one, easily. Because the person who didn't speak, I understand that. I've been in rooms where I knew the math didn't work, and I let it go because I was junior, and the cost of being wrong in public felt higher than the cost of being right in private. That's a rational calculation in a broken system. I don't love it, but I understand it. The confident one is harder to sit with, because in that story, I am the broken system. That one doesn't have a good excuse attached to it. That one just requires you to look at it honestly and own it.
You work in AI governance and data strategy as well. Is this problem worse there than it was in security?
Yeah, I think it's worse. And faster. Which seems a bit off when I say it out loud. But let me explain. In security, the failure cycle has some natural forcing functions. Something breaks. There's an incident. The controls either worked or they didn't, and you find out. The feedback loop is longer than I'd like, but it exists. In AI, particularly right now in this moment where everybody is building strategy decks and announcing AI initiatives and positioning for the transformation, the feedback loop is very, very slow. Because the thing you're claiming to know is probabilistic and complex, and you can frame almost any outcome as consistent with the original thesis if you try hard enough. And there is a specific failure mode I see constantly in boardrooms. A leader walks in, smart, accomplished. The team has been working on an AI initiative for 6, 9 months. There's a slide deck, there's a roadmap, there's a confidence interval on something that probably shouldn't have a confidence interval, and the leader nods in the right places, asks 2 questions that signal engagement without actually disturbing the narrative, approves the next phase. The team walks out thinking they were heard. The leader walks out thinking they made a decision. Six months later, something breaks. And in the post-mortem, you find out that someone, usually someone technical, usually someone without a lot of political capital, had concerns, specific ones, about the data quality, about a label drift, about whether the vendor's numbers were actually reproducible. They said it once. The room didn't want it. They stopped. The model didn't fail. The room failed.
The conventional answer here is be more humble, admit uncertainty, create psychological safety. You've critiqued that framing before. Why doesn't it satisfy you?
Because it becomes its own performance. And look, the underlying instinct is right. The field is over-indexed on certainty. The correction is real. The diagnosis is accurate. But then what happens is people take be vulnerable and they treat it like a leadership technique. They work on their vulnerability communication skills. They practice saying, I don't know, in a way that sounds strategic and intentional. And then you've just replaced one form of performance with a more palatable one. I've watched leaders go through vulnerability training and come out the other side more managed than they went in, more curated, more aware of how the admission of uncertainty lands in the room and what it does for their brand. That's not humility. That's humility as brand strategy.
So what's the actual alternative?
I'm not sure there's a clean one, which is probably part of the answer. I think the thing that is real is when the cost is real. When you say, I don't know, in a room where not knowing has consequences that land on you. When you change your mind publicly about something you championed, and the record of you championing it is right there, and you do it anyway because the evidence changed and you actually updated. That's different from performing intellectual humility. There's friction in it. It costs you something in the room. Your credibility takes a small hit in that moment, and you absorb it because the alternative is continuing to act on a premise that you know is wrong. Most of what I see in the leadership content space right now, and I include some of my own earlier work in this, is people finding ways to perform intellectual humility without absorbing the actual cost of it. That's the gap I'm trying to be honest about.
When's the last time you absorbed the actual cost?
I've been building toward a new positioning in my career. The role of a chief data and AI officer, not just security. I am super excited to see how we, as a community, navigate the security, the privacy, the trust aspects of AI from a CISO perspective. That's a pretty interesting complexity to navigate. The aspects of innovation speed and the guardrails to constrain the risk. And for a long time, I was framing the convergence argument in a way that felt tight and compelling and landed well in rooms. And someone I trust pushed back. He said the framing was doing work that the underlying thinking hadn't fully earned yet, that some of it was thesis-shaped, conclusion-shaped content, not actual analysis, that it is 18 months out from an industry adoption, if at all. And he was right. It took me a few weeks to sit with it, to wrap my head around what it truly looks like. And then I had to go back and rebuild parts of the argument from scratch. And to make it worse, I had to have a tough discussion with my spouse about my career, about the hat or hats that I wear, the direction I think we should take. That's not fun. It's not the version I would have put on LinkedIn before that conversation. But I think it's more honest. And I think it's actually stronger for it.
Earlier, you mentioned coming up wiring buildings and machines. You go back to that image a lot.
Yeah, I do. I think because it was the first place I learned what real feedback feels like. You wire something wrong, you find out. Not next quarter, not in a post-mortem, right then. The system tells you. And there's something almost relieving about that once you get past the jolt. The world is giving you accurate information. The further up you go in most organizations, the slower and more filtered the feedback gets. And that filter is expensive, even when it doesn't feel like it. Because decisions made on filtered information have a hidden cost that doesn't show up until much later, sometimes years later, by which time the people who made the calls have moved on, and someone else is holding the consequence. I think one of the things I'm always trying to rebuild, regardless of what level I'm operating at, is something closer to that original feedback loop, where the information is fast and indifferent and unimpressed by how good the presentation looked.
Okay. How do you actually rebuild that in an executive context then?
A few things that have worked for me. I spend a lot of time with the people who are closest to the actual work, not just their managers, them. The person who is running the specific system, or writing the specific code, or pulling the specific data. Because their read of reality is much less filtered than the one that reaches me through the organizational structure. I also try to keep relationships outside the chain of command where someone is professionally obligated to agree with me. People who will tell me when something doesn't add up. That's harder to maintain at the senior level because the title creates distance, and distance creates a kind of courteous deference that is basically useless for this purpose. And I ask a question now. I've started asking it deliberately, which is, when was the last time someone who didn't work for me changed my mind about something? If I can't answer that quickly with a specific example, that's data. That's telling me the feedback loop is clogged.
That's pretty good. You've described this failure mode from the outside. Have you been inside it? Not the person who didn't push back, the room that didn't want it.
Yeah, of course. I think the first time I was really aware of it as it was happening, not in retrospect, was early in a leadership role where I had come in with a strong point of view, which is usually the right move. You do the diligence, you form a thesis, you come in with conviction. That's what you're supposed to do. But conviction, if you're not careful, starts to function like a filter. And I think what happened in that period, I was in my mid-30s, first real leadership role at scale, is that I was selecting the signals that confirmed the direction I'd already committed to, and not actively seeking the ones that would complicate it. Nobody was lying to me. Nobody was hiding information. The information was available. I just wasn't going looking for it in the same way once I had already decided. That's not dishonesty. That's just how the brain works when you've already committed publicly. But it's still a form of performative certainty. because I was presenting confidence to the organization that I was no longer maintaining on the inside through the actual work.
Okay, what broke it open then?
Someone I respected, genuinely respected, not just professionally, told me that the people closest to the work had stopped raising questions. Not that they'd been told to stop, just that they'd stopped, and that when they stopped raising questions, it wasn't a sign of alignment. It was a sign that they didn't believe it would matter. That landed hard, because the thing I cared most about in that role, and I still care about this, is building environments where people can tell you the thing that's true before it becomes the thing that's expensive. And I had built something that looked like that from above and wasn't. That's the version of this failure that I think about most. Because it wasn't dramatic. Nobody was being suppressed. The culture was fine by any external measure. It was just a slow drift toward comfortable. And comfortable is where knowing stops.
That's a tough one, I can imagine. Last question. And I want you to actually try to answer it, not perform an answer. How do you know when you know?
I'm not sure I always do. I think what I'm learning, and I want to be honest that this is still very much in progress for me, is that genuine knowing has a different texture than the performed version. It comes with more questions attached. It comes with a clearer sense of what it doesn't cover. It's more restless, actually, than the sound of knowing tends to be. The sound of knowing is smooth. It has a cadence and a rhythm, and it lands well. And sometimes that smoothness is real. It's what competence feels like when it's been built over time and earned. But sometimes it's just a thing the brain does when it's decided to stop looking. So I guess the question I try to ask myself now is, am I still looking? Is there still something alive and uncomfortable in the problem? Because when the discomfort goes away completely, when it all feels resolved and confident and clean, that's usually when I need to go find the thing I'm not seeing. That's not a satisfying answer, but I think it's an honest one.
I think it is.
There's one more thing I want to say, actually, before we end, if I may. And it's the thing I find hardest to say in rooms where I'm trying to establish credibility. I am genuinely working on this. Not as a brand position, not as a communication strategy. Genuinely. The gap between how I think and how I'm able to express it in public, that gap is real, and I'm aware of it, and it's not fully closed yet. I think that's part of what this is for. The thinking out loud, the discomfort of saying something imprecise in front of people, and then trying to find the more precise version of it, like we are right now. That process is where the knowing actually gets built. So, that's where I am with it.